All right. Hey, good afternoon, folks. Once again, we are back taking a look at the tropics. Today is Wednesday, June 12th, 2024, and we are back for another year on the page with the video updates. I decided to get a new mic, kind of dust off the recording software. Got some stuff to talk about. We've got an area of interest over Florida. We got some more stuff trying to develop in the Gulf of Mexico in a couple days. So we're going to get into it all this afternoon. Appreciate you guys being here for another season. We've been doing regular stuff on the Facebook page. But of course, when this thing really gets cooking, we go to the video updates as well. So we got to talk about both Invest 90L over the Gulf of, was over the Gulf of Mexico, has now moved over Florida. And then we're also going to talk about this concern, not what I'm actually circling, but in this area, a concern we may have in about a week or so's time. So let's go ahead and get right into the Hurricane Center's update. They have Invest 90L here parked over Central Florida this afternoon, just to the west of the Space Coast. This has been tagged Invest 90L, but again, Invest just means something the Hurricane Center can call it to talk about it with their friends and with the hurricane hunters. It's not a tropical storm. It's not a depression. It's not named. It's just an area of interest for all intents and purposes. This was a system that formed off a cold front, really more of a front, not so much a cold front at this point. But you have a very clear separation of air masses this afternoon over northern and central Florida. You have drier high pressure anchored in here. And then to the south, you've got this just relentless stream of tropical moisture opened up. And right between there and that boundary, you've got just training heavy tropical rainfall. We've seen up to 16 inches of rain in South Florida over the last about 36 hours. And that much more could fall in the next day or two. It is an incredible amount of rainfall for South Florida, and a once in a generation type flooding event is underway right now as I'm recording this. Parts of Miami, Hollywood, Dania Beach, Hialeah are all under a flash flood emergency, and widespread catastrophic flooding is ongoing. Now, Invest 90L, our swirling low pressure right about here, doesn't have that much to do with it, although this is kind of focusing that rainfall a little more to the south. It's a low that's just spun up on this boundary that's kind of aiding the whole thing, but it would have been going on whether this low developed or not. So this is not so much being watched for what it's doing today, but for the potential it has to develop once it gets offshore, because this low is going to move away, although this overall pattern of tropical moisture over this region is not going to go anywhere for about 2 or 3 more days. So, unfortunately, even though AL90 moves out, this is still going to be occurring in South Florida, where they're getting way too much rain too fast, even though they needed it, and parts of central and northern Florida that really needed the rain aren't going to be getting a whole lot over the next couple of days. So we're not going to spend a lot more time on 90L because the future of 90L isn't much to talk about. It's a little low that's going to move up the coast, and GFS and European Ensembles, fantastic agreement here. This is just going to move up the coast and it's going to dissipate. We really don't have a lot to worry about with this one in terms of any future impacts. Very well could be named down the line. The upper level winds do become a little bit more favorable for it. And we could see a depression or storm form. Would be Alex, I think, is the next or the first name on the list this year, or it's Alberto. I actually should know that, but I don't. But first name storm could very well become this, but it is no threat to anyone else once it moves away. And again, the rain in Florida is only loosely associated with 90L. It would be going on regardless. So that's kind of all that is on there. The intensity models also show some potential for development, but again, nothing crazy. And overall, that rainfall still to come for South Florida is tremendous. Now, if you're looking at this map, you may also have a keen eye and be looking over at the Gulf Coast and go, well, that's weird, because I also see a lot of rain coming for parts of Houston and parts of Louisiana and even parts of Mississippi and Alabama's coastline. What's going on there? Well, that would be loosely associated with our second area of interest, which is marked on the Hurricane Center's map as a 30% chance of development down the line. Outside of the 2-day window, no chance in the next 2 or 3 days, but going into 4, 5, 6, 7 days, we could have a system trying to form in the southern Gulf of Mexico. This is somewhat related to the tropical pattern over Florida. This whole tropical moisture pump continues to fill up this area with deep tropical moisture, and as the upper level weather pattern begins to shift, right now there's strong wind shear and winds over Florida. this is all going to relent into the weekend as a big trough dips down in there. So right now, again, this is the kind of the setup here this afternoon and tomorrow. High pressure or high heights aloft over Mexico, pushing strong winds into this region. However, in a couple of days into the weekend, this trough comes in and everything begins to switch. The high pressure then relocates to the north, and then this high pressure, this light wind dome begins to expand. Well, as this little dome of higher heights and lighter winds expands towards the Gulf of Mexico, that will begin to let something develop. Again, why 90L didn't develop when it came across here was because there's just a ton of wind shear right now. It has no hope of developing given the setup. But once that relents going into early next week, we may have a bit of a cocoon, if you will, for something to try to get going down in the southern Gulf of Mexico, or maybe Western Caribbean, or even offshore of Mexico to the west in the Eastern Pacific. We could have some kind of crossover where a low pressure or a storm spins up in the East Pacific, gets an East Pacific name, then moves inland and moves across into the Gulf of Mexico and reforms on the Atlantic side. There's a lot of potential possibilities there. Our computer models do show this pretty well as I back up and go into later on Saturday, GFS showing 3 distinct areas of rotation on Saturday afternoon, including one of them in the East Pac being an organized tropical system, and then also showing that background spinach here on the western side of the Caribbean. If we back up, the European model shows kind of the same thing on Saturday afternoon, just not as pronounced. 18Z, same time for the GFS, but this is the European. Much generally weaker and broad low pressure. But basically, this whole region is going to be spinning into the weekend and early next week. Within that, we could have smaller low pressure areas or even organized tropical storms forming in this broad low. It's a big, slowly rotating tropical mess is the best way to put it. If I kind of had to give you a description, imagine the little teacup ride at like the carnival or the fair where the whole platform spins, but then your little teacup spins inside of the spinning platform. Basically what we're talking about. All these guys are spinning in the same direction, and then on top of that, the whole background is also spinning until one of them kind of becomes dominant, and then the whole thing kind of shifts together and kind of rotates around itself. So that's kind of what the models show in some sense. The Europeans, we go into next week, shows some signal for maybe some Eastern Pacific development, just like the GFS did, going into Sunday into Monday, and then spin something up into the Atlantic. But again, a broad, kind of messy, maybe tropical storm into Tuesday, Wednesday, with most of the associated winds and rain associated going into Mexico. But this would still pump a lot of that same kind of Gulf moisture that Florida was getting, but the flow reverses, and instead all that moisture goes back into parts of Texas and maybe even into parts of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama as well. But the low buries itself in Mexico. Now, the GFS shows us a little bit of this is the overall moisture that does agree with that, but the GFS in actuality does show us something a little bit different. It has a system kind of crossing over just like the European does, but if you're one of those model watchers down the line, it then spuriously spins up another tropical system after that, another week down the road, and then brings us into the Gulf Coast. The thing is, this is a very common GFS bias. I would put no stock into it until we have some other evidence besides the GFS a million years down the road said this was going to happen. So when you see a model run and some Yahoo on Twitter or Facebook post this picture and is like, get ready, Central Louisiana, they're just full of crap. I tell you guys this every year. This ain't happening until it's happening. And this is June 24th. This is, this is like 12 to 14 days out. We're not looking that far. But in the shorter term, the GFS does agree with the European model that we do have some low pressure trying to develop down in the southern Gulf of Mexico early next week. This will largely depend if the low is over land, offshore, somewhere in between, and then what the upper level winds look like. But as it stands right now, it appears there's a decent chance the strong ridging of the Bermuda Azores High is going to shunt whatever does come out of this off to the west. So I'd say, maybe Central Gulf Coast to Texas are your goalposts for now on anything that could develop, and then we'll kind of look at it in more detail. Both the European and GFS ensembles generally agree doing the squish spider thing, which is just key for, hey, something's going to form down here and then probably drift this kind of direction. That's really what the models are showing you, besides those few GFS outliers that are doing the silly thing I told you about a minute ago. So that's what we got overall. So again, rainfall continues for South Florida, very heavy. Flash flooding emergencies will be ongoing. It'll be a ridiculous flood threats still to come for parts of central South Florida, especially Miami and Southwest Florida. The Keys are also in on it. And then northern Florida, you're going to get a little bit of rain, but it's going to be hit or miss. It's going to be sporadic. And then as we work into the weekend, early next week, watching for low pressure to spin up here. And then this overall pattern where the heavy tropical rains are moving this way over Florida, they're going to reverse. And then we're going to begin to see heavier tropical rains spreading into the central and the western Gulf Coast over the week as we start next work week, and then we could eventually see that low pressure ride up in some capacity either into Mexico or Texas, or maybe even points further off to the east where the central and western Gulf Coast will have to watch that. That's the bottom line, best I can describe it. So that's what I got for you guys today. We may or may not do another video tomorrow. We may have another day or two, but we'll be watching this into the weekend. We'll have more updates, and of course on the Facebook page, daily updates as they are warranted. So that's what I got for you guys tonight. As always, thanks for watching and have a good one.